Welcome back, guys. I'm bringing it back to the roots of podcasting. I'm in a small room. This is it. It's really hot in here. I'm sweating already. But I wanted to talk about the will, your choice, Bottom line is, I think it's an illusion. I think it's all fake. It's a facade. I think we think we're in control, but we're not. I'll just start with the classic nature nurture, right? What causes you to be who you are, nature or nurture? Well, the answer that the smartest people will give you is both. And the thing is either one is determined for you. That's the whole summary, right? Both are determined, right? Whether it's in your DNA, like you're born with it, you're born to be who you're going to be, or the environment that you did not choose decides for you what you're going to be. I really don't understand this argument of I have the choice to yada, yada, yada because of influence. Influence is such a powerful thing, and it's subtle, and it's subvert but like subconscious, and it's sub everything, it's beneath it all. You don't sense it, you don't see it, but it is there, and that is huge. This is somewhat of a Christian podcast. Like, I'm very Christian, but what I mean is like the topics I might explore aren't, in the niche of Christianity, whatever the case is, if I talk about art or whatever. But there is a lot of Bible to it. I could maybe put it, at the end or something. I don't know. So as a Christian, I don't see where there is any room to think of that. I mean, if we think about the influence of sin, right, which we all agree, we're all supposed to agree that there is an influence of sin in our life from birth, because we are dead to our sin and we are born in sin. Doesn't necessarily mean we're evil, but we're broken, and so we have proclivities and leanings, which I learned that is what iniquity means. It's you have a leaning towards a certain kind of sin or something. And because of that, we don't have the free will to choose whether or not we do that thing or not. I think that in its most basic sense, should close the discussion. I mean, when you look up, let's look up what free will is. It is the power of acting without the constraint of necessity or fate, the ability to act on one's own discretion. So I think that if we understand that is the definition of free will, then no one's free to will anything. Again, it goes back to influence. I guess I've thought about this so much. I really simplified it. That's it. That's all there is. But when you think about so I guess that goes into how determined are my choices, and if everything has been written out, or how does that really work? And it seems like there is determinism and free will, right? Like, you're either free to do whatever you want, or everything, like you're just watching a movie in first person. And I used to be that way. I used to really think everything is determined, and I believed in hard determinism, which is that essentially that you're just watching a movie and everything has been played out for you. It's just because people say things like this: God is in control. Any mention of God's sovereignty, you have to put this into account. If God is in control of my life and my circumstance and my situation, let's say for a job, that means that God has to be in control of people who choose my job. God has to be in control of the economy for the need of me to have this job. God has to be in control of a lot of things outside of myself for him to be in control of my life. So if we pretend if we're the only person that exists truly and everything else is just for our amusement and our living, then sure, God is in control of the whole world, every detail, and then we get to dance and do whatever we want. But the reality is that we're not unique and we're not singular. I mean, we're not the center of the story. And so in the same way that God shifts things around, puts ideas in people's minds and puts certain stressors and this and that so that things can happen the way they ought to for my life to go according to plan, then for God to do that for someone else's life, then he has to do this kind of the same things with me, right? To put in aligned, to put align someone else's life. So when you think about other people, not just yourself, right? Then it gets really convoluted, this whole idea of God's in control, but I get to choose. And I think honestly that kind of goes down a rabbit hole of just how people in general don't seem to think through all their ideas. And that's what we have. It's a people with like half thought out ideas, and they live by it because it doesn't really get shaken up. And this is deep philosophy, and like, does it really matter, right? But as I am a pursuer of truth, and I love truth, and I desire to know the truth, I ask myself these questions, and so that's kind of what started my pursuit in this idea of will, right? If God's in control, then for God to be in control of my life, he has to be in control of someone else's life, and to do its will so that I can get what I need or whatever God has planned for me, and vice versa. And the vice versa is really what gets me, is like, well, then if it's God's will for me to be someone's friend, then God has to put something in me to desire to be this person's friend, so that we can go through life together and all this and that. Because again, I'm not going to do something that is against my will. And this is where the illusion of free will comes in. I'm not saying that God scripts out our life and we're forced to do it, because it doesn't feel like that, right? Like, I'm very pragmatic when it comes to thinking and ideology. But I will say that God can change our emotions and things. Like, how many times have we either had a friend that we're like, oh, not in a million years would I have been friends with this person, but it just worked out, and this and that. Like, those kinds of things where like, my heart is changing for this thing. I did not expect it to, and I'm going to follow my heart. At the end of the day, we follow our heart. And that's one of the verses in Proverbs. I might just put it down like here or something. But that it is man makes plans in his heart, but God determines its steps. So it's this really confusing paradox. And when Tim Keller talks about this, he brings up this paradox, and he says that there is complete responsibility, but there is like a sense of determinism, and God is completely in control. And so the way at least I understand when he talks about it, he does this thing. He talks about how we have the will, with all the influences and this and that, and like we get to decide things, but it's almost like the reaction that comes from us making decisions is God's choice. And so it's like, well, another Bible verse that says that God even determines like the cast of a die, which is crazy, because we understand dice. When we throw dice, it's supposed to be random, right? Yeah, there's probability and this and that, but God determines even that, which you think it's so insignificant. It's like the toss of a dice. So like, it's almost like even gambling, God is in control of. Even when we win or lose, God is sovereign over that, which could go down another route that I couldn't explore by myself, because that's not something I really partake in. But if even that's so we throw the dice, we decide to throw the dice, we want to throw the dice or not, and we do that. But then whatever happens after that is God's decision. So I think about like when we have something to say to someone and we say it, and their reaction. This is how conversations go, right? Like, I react, you react, I react, you react, and that's kind of how conversations go. And so God controls like the reaction, maybe like how it hits us, right? If someone's gonna tell me like, hey, you're being a turd or something, it might be that I blow up. It might be that I take that well. It might be that I shut down. It might be that, whatever the case happens. And maybe it seems like I speak, there's a filter of God's sovereignty. And when it hits my ears, goes into my heart, whatever it produces in me is God's intention. And then whatever I say will then, vice versa. Now that gets convoluted, because then you would think, why would arguments happen? Why would fighting happen? Why do conversations end up in accidental killings and all these things? And that kind of gets me to this point, right? If maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but the point of all of life is for God to glorify himself, which I think is very in a direction that no one really goes down, because it doesn't sell, right? Because we want to think that the point of life, even as a Christian, the point of life is to love, and the point of life is community, and the point of life is to spread the gospel, and this and that. The ultimate point of life is for God to glorify himself. And you can talk about how, that's narcissistic and da-da-da-da. The thing is, narcissism is founded on imposter syndrome. And God is the guy. So you can't be narcissistic when it all does belong to you, when you are the ruler and the authority of the universe. So that's unfounded. If you understand psychology, that those two things just don't mix. For the president to act like the president and then be a good president, that's not narcissistic, right? And so for God to be a good God and to show himself to the whole universe and everyone to acknowledge, wow, this is a good God, that's just him being God, right? So for him to glorify himself. And I've been thinking about, and this goes into suffering and this and that, because that will come up, right? Then if everything is determined by God, or however it's determined by God, then God is evil. And it's not necessarily true. Showing the absence of him and the chaos that ensues is glorifying to him. If people drown because there aren't life vests, that gives glory to life vests, in the sense that if they had a life vest, they wouldn't die. And if life vests had 100% a save rate, then that gives glory to life vests. I think it's because God wants us as a collective mind to transform. And it's not just individuals to lock themselves up in, some kind of castle that's enclosed, whatever, and then live that out while the rest of the world kills themselves and, does worse. It behooves God and behooves us to understand that life without God is chaos and pain and suffering. And with God, it is at least purposeful, and it goes in a direction. And that kind of goes into my definition of evil, which I do think that evil is defined by purposelessness. And I say that because when I read through the Bible, pain and suffering is not evil. It is transformative. I just listened to Jeff Wittick, I think his name is, talk on George Janko, and he talked about how his life was transformed multiple times. Him going to jail made him sober up, get clean, and start working out, and get healthy and all this stuff. And then whatever happened with his eye, not too familiar. I'm sorry to any. I know I do live under a rock, but that changed his trajectory, and now he is wondering about God and all these things. And so pain and suffering shows us that we're not in control. And there are verses that really cling on to me, because as of late, this is how I've been feeling. People who don't acknowledge God and who don't care about that stuff, they are successful. And it's a lucky run. It's a lucky run because I understand that they feel invincible because God has allowed them not to suffer, which is so, from my perspective, unjust and all these things. But it's funny, that these people make a hell of their own lives. You look at P. Diddy, you look at, all these famous people. They get so famous and so powerful that they just start degrading as human beings. Like, morality and consciousness just kind of is thrown away, and they become a vessel of lust, a vessel of, whether it's lust of women, lust of power, lust of money. Like, they just become a ball of unchecked desire. And they degrade themselves and destroy themselves. And it's only when they look at themselves through a camera in a courtroom do they realize, crap, I messed up. If that. I'm all over the place. And this is how my mind works, by the way. I am all over the place all the time. It might be hard to follow. I apologize. I really do apologize, because people like Jordan Peterson and Russell Brand, dude, these people may be smart, sure, but they're just so hard to follow sometimes, and it just it's just unbearable sometimes. I will say, having conversations with other people help me focus, help me slow down, especially if they ask a lot of questions and they carry the conversation in a slow pace. So I enjoy that. But when it's me and myself, I'm all over the place, which is why I stutter a lot, and because I'm always trying to think about what I just said and try to keep it linear. But if I'm free flowing, dude, it's game over. It's all over. But going back, so free will. Are we truly free? I don't think so. I think that influence is a huge thing. I think when we think about influence, and we'll actually, let's just dive into that. So influence, one thing that was huge for me, which might be a little ironic because I started late. Women, I guess, in my life was very important. The attention of women and the affection and the intimacy of women was very important to me growing up. Not that it used to be, I would say. And I guess growing up that was always the case, but it was when I herniated a disc, broke up with my girlfriend, everything was going wrong in my life, that I went down the hole. So when I was 18 or 19 is actually when I started watching pornography, which is very late for most. But nonetheless, I didn't have to work for the attention, the intimacy, and this and that, because it was just freely given. That's it. Sorry, if you know, you know. But that lingo is just kind of funny because God's grace is freely given. Anyways, but it was a monster in my life. Truly, I could not escape the grasp of the influence it had in my life. Now, through a lot of therapy, prayer, a lot of accepting of God's love and grace, covering all areas of my life, chasing after purity. So even to this day, a friend of mine has the password to my parental lock. Can't get on Twitter, can't get on Reddit, can't see any dirty sites, and that protects me. So now it's a thing that's not super big in my life, in the sense that I'm not saying I'm perfect. I get tempted. I'll take the second glance. I'll take, a second too long, whatever the case is. But it's something I can say no to, where before, I'm not lying to you. There were times where I would be in the middle of it crying. I can't believe this is happening again. I thought I was delivered, or I thought this was over, or whatever the case was. There has been, and it was an evolution too. Like I said before, it was for intimacy, emotional intimacy, attention, validation, all these things. And then it changed into lack of purpose and lost, and it gave me whatever, like it gave me dopamine, it gave me pleasure, it gave me these things, and it was not emotional at all. And there was like an evolution of these things as I was going through, which gets me to the point. I think that our freedom is a spectrum, and the spectrum is something like P. Diddy to Jesus. And what is the spectrum? It's the spectrum of freedom. P. Diddy cannot help himself because he has indulged himself. He has gone down that rabbit hole so far that he cannot get himself out of it. He does not desire to get himself out of it. Being destructive at any cost, or doing these things at any cost, being all the destructiveness, like he doesn't even consider these things. He doesn't even think about it. He just cares about the fulfilling the desire. That is all he is now. He is a vessel of satisfying desire. Hedonistic. That's not freedom. He's enslaved. And so when we look at, I think it's Romans 6, when it talks about being either a slave to sin or a slave to righteousness, and you really, like, if that is a choice, that it might be the only choice that we have, is regardless, we are slaves, but we can either be slaves to sin or slave to righteousness. And what that looks like is that as a slave of righteousness, Jesus is the example of this. He could have gone down this road, but he didn't. He chose something else, which means that when you are a slave of righteousness, there are now two options. You can either do the right thing or do the wrong thing, which is the choice that we think we have. Where if we go all the way down to being a slave of sin, and P. Diddy might be an extreme case of what it looks like, but choosing your hatred, choosing jealousy, choosing envy, choosing bitterness, right? Choosing depression, choosing sadness, right? These are cycles that sometimes we can't crawl out of because we don't want to. And so, when we look at our relationship with parents, with exes, with people who have hurt us, right? As slaves of sin, we have no other option but to continue in the hurt, continue in the pain, continue with that thing that always keeps the cycle going, whereas slaves of righteousness can break that. So it becomes a spectrum in the sense that the closer we are to God and the closer that we are to Jesus, the more that God's grace fills us, satisfies us, and changes us and transforms us, the more we have a choice. And I think that becomes what truly is the idea of our will. I think I haven't heard anyone talk about it. That's probably because I just don't read many books. But I think that becomes the spectrum, and that becomes the truth of how we live, is that freedom can be defined as the power to say no. And it's not saying yes to everything, because some of those yeses will always be yeses in our life. Like I talked about, it doesn't have to be drugs, it doesn't have to be women and pornography and all these things. It can be hatred, it can be bitterness, it can be sadness, comparison. Like there are bad habits that we have that we can't shake off because we don't have a choice. That's embedded in our identity. And giving that to God, giving ourselves to God, when we stop following ourselves, right? That is Matthew 16:44, if I'm not mistaken. Deny yourself, carry your cross. Deny yourself means to not follow yourself. And these things, this is what it looks like. We look at that as like some moral thing, like drugs and women and alcohol and all these things. Don't do those things. But it's bitterness and anger, and it's jealousy, and it's strife, right? Dissensions. It's the emotional things too. It's the bad parts of our personalities that and the good. I mean, if we live in complete surrender, the next verse says, if you chase after your life, you will lose your life. If you lose your life for my sake, you will find it. And so I do think that God is talking about, Jesus is talking about our freedom, our liberty to be who we are intended to be. And I think that's where it gets, practical, right? I gave all the brainy stuff and the map of how that works out. I can get into more detail. I don't think anyone cares that much, but if we are trapped in who we are, that's been determined. But if we give to God who we are, He can create something new, something with freedom. And so I hope that motivates you to give more to God, and because that's the point. And so I guess I'm going to start praying us out of these things, because why not? But God, I just pray that that we can have the courage and boldness to give ourselves to you. God, we pray that this inspires us, God, to realize our sin, realize the cycles that we're in, that we can't get out of, God, and we give that to you. God, we also pray that if we fall back into cycles, God, that we trust in you, that we continue to trust that you will mold us and create new things in us, God, new desires, God, because we know that taking the bad out doesn't change anything, but that we need to replace that with something, God, and you will always replace that with something good. And we believe all of this in your name. Amen.